My parents forgot my birthday 3 times because their golden child threw another tantrum. After 15 years of neglect, my family looked pretty normal from the outside, but inside it was like we were living in 2 different worlds. I was the older brother just by a year, but in our house it felt like I was from a different planet compared to my sister. My sister Emily was born with chronic health problems and a physical disability. Her life was a series of doctor's visits, special accommodations, and a lot of other challenges. My parents did everything they could to make Emily's life easier and happier, which I appreciate, but it meant they didn't really show up for me the same way. From as early as I can remember, I was the healthy, easy kid, which meant I was expected to fend for myself a lot. My parents were always making special time for Emily and planning things that could accommodate her limitations. That stuff takes a lot of time and energy, I know, but it left little room for anything else, including me. When Emily and I were little, I remember being excited about family outings, thinking maybe this time we'd all go together. But more often than not, I ended up staying with a neighbor or dropped off at Aunt Linda's place. They always said, "We'll bring you next time," or, "It's just easier if Emily doesn't have to travel too far today." But those next times never seemed to come. It wasn't just the trips. It was the everyday things, too, like playing in the park, going for ice cream, or just watching a movie together. They always chose something that fit Emily's needs. I understand she needed more care, but it often felt like they forgot they had another kid who also wanted to feel like part of the family. I think the first time I really felt the sting of being the forgotten one was during one of my birthdays. It must have been my 9th or 10th birthday. There was no party, no special dinner. I woke up that day thinking maybe they had a surprise planned, but nothing happened. They took Emily to a concert she had been looking forward to for months. It just so happened to fall on my birthday. They came back talking about how much fun it was and how it was such a good show. I just sat there feeling pretty invisible. The next day, my mom realized they'd missed my birthday. She tried to make up for it by handing me a $5 gift card. It was a nice gesture, but it felt like an afterthought. It was insignificant compared to the effort they put into making sure Emily could see her favorite band live. As we got older, this pattern didn't really change. It was always about what Emily needed, and I was expected to understand and not make a fuss. I spent a lot of time alone or at friends' houses. I just wanted to feel seen. I remember for 1 year I was turning 10. That was a big deal for any kid. I had been dropping hints about wanting to do something fun as a family, maybe hit the local arcade or have a pizza party at home. But as the day drew closer, I could tell that nothing was planned. There were no whispers of secret plans or hidden gifts around the house. When my birthday finally came around, it was like everyone had forgotten. There was no happy birthday at breakfast, and conversations about what Emily needed for the day were the focus. She had been having a rough time. I had a rough week health-wise, so I understood that my parents were focusing on my sister's needs. I went to school that day, hoping my parents would remember and maybe surprise me when I got back home. When I walked back in through the door that afternoon, it was clear that wasn't happening. There was no surprise, no cake waiting on the counter. My mom was on the phone, sorting out some new therapy sessions for Emily, and my dad was at work as usual. It felt like any other day, except it wasn't. It was supposed to be my day. I didn't say anything. What was the point? It wouldn't make them remember or care. I just went to my room and tried to make the best of it. My friends at school had said happy birthday. They even pulled together some change to buy me an ice cream at lunch, which was nice. It helped a little. It made the day feel a bit less ordinary. The next day, my mom must have seen the date on something because she suddenly realized they'd missed it. On my birthday, she apologized and said things had just been so hectic with Emily. I nodded and said it was okay, but it wasn't really. They promised we'd do something that week to make up for it, but plans fell through again. Emily wasn't feeling up for going out, and instead of doing something at home, we ended up just watching some of her favorite movies. My dad picked up a cake, one of those pre-made ones from the grocery store, but it was just another day, nothing special. It wasn't a celebration. This wasn't new. It was just more of the same. Another year, another forgotten celebration. It wasn't just about the party or gifts. It was about feeling recognized, feeling like I mattered too. But each missed birthday was a reminder that in the grand scheme of things, my needs, my desires were always on the back burner. By the time my 12th birthday rolled around, I had lowered my expectations. I didn't bother hinting or asking for anything. I didn't ask for anything because I didn't think it would happen. I spent my birthday like any other day, doing my homework, playing video games, and helping around the house. My parents remembered to say happy birthday, but it was just a quick hug and acknowledgement before they went back to their usual routine. Emily had a doctor's appointment that day, so most of the attention was on getting her ready and out the door. It wasn't the fact that it was a bad birthday that hurt the most. It was the fact that it was so normal. There was no neglect out of malice. It was just neglect out of habit. They were so used to pouring all their energy into Emily's needs that mine just didn't register on their radar. It wasn't just birthdays. It was school achievements, hobbies, things I was proud of. They all just sort of got nodded at and then brushed aside as I got older. As I got older, I started to feel like I was just expected to accept things. I stopped expecting things to be different. When friends had birthday parties, it was a glimpse of what it could be like with parents who planned and celebrated their kids. I enjoyed those moments and then went home to my reality. In therapy, we started going a few years later. One of the therapists pointed out that these missed moments were significant. They weren't just little slips. They were patterns that showed where the priorities lay. In those sessions, I tried to express how these patterns made me feel unimportant compared to my parents. They listened, but there was always an excuse or a reason why things had to be the way they were. They promised to try harder to be more aware, but habits of a lifetime are hard to break. Looking back now, I can see how these early experiences shaped my expectations about life and relationships. They taught me to not ask for too much or to not expect too much, which means you can't be disappointed. They also taught me what kind of parent I want to be someday. Someone who remembers and celebrates each child for who they are, not just for what they need. My grandparents were the unsung heroes of my childhood. With my parents usually wrapped up in the endless cycle of managing Emily's health issues, it was Grandma and Grandpa who stepped in to fill the void. They didn't do anything extraordinary, but in my world, they were a beacon of normalcy and warmth. They were a contrast to the cold. At home, Grandma had a way of making every little thing seem special. She had this old recipe book, and every time I visited, she'd let me pick a recipe to try out together. It didn't matter if it was her famous chocolate chip cookies or something as simple as spaghetti. It was our thing. During these cooking sessions, she'd share stories about her own childhood and the mischief she got into with her siblings. I lived for those stories. They were a window into a different world. I felt connected to a world where I wasn't just another child. Grandpa was the quiet strength of the pair. He was a man of few words, but he had a presence that made you feel secure. He loved model trains, and the basement of their house was dedicated to his elaborate setups. He'd spend hours down there tweaking and fixing, and I was always welcome to join. It wasn't just about the trains. It was about sharing something he loved with me. He loved me and made me feel like I was the most important person in the world. His house was my refuge. The days I spent there were the days I felt most like a kid, not just a bystander in my sister's life. They celebrated every report card and every small achievement that my parents often overlooked. When I scored my first goal in soccer, Grandma made a cake and Grandpa put up a little display in the living room with the ball I'd used. The game was the biggest deal, and that meant everything to me. But life has a way of reminding you that nothing stays the same. 3 years ago, Grandma got sick. It wasn't sudden. It was a slow decline that seemed to parallel the gradual fading of my childhood innocence. Her vibrant energy dimmed, and the kitchen, which had been the heart of our interactions, grew silent. I watched helplessly as the disease took hold, turning our cooking sessions into brief, strained visits where she'd mostly sleep while I sat by her side holding her hand, missing her even though she was right there when she passed away. It was like losing a part of my foundation. The funeral was a blur, a procession of people offering their condolences, saying how wonderful she had been and how she'd be missed. I nodded, thanked them, but inside I felt a hollowing out, like someone had scooped out the center of me. Grandpa changed after Grandma's death. The spark that had been in his eyes, when he showed me a new train setup or told a joke, It made the basement gatherings less frequent, and then they stopped altogether. He moved through the days mechanically, without joy. The model trains gathered dust, and our conversations grew stilted. We were both lost in our grief. It wasn't long before we decided to move him to a nursing home in another city. The house was too big and too full of memories for him alone. I understood the reasons, but it felt like another anchor being lifted. Our visits became monthly trips that were more about ensuring he was okay rather than sharing anything meaningful. I'd sit in the sterile visitor room making small talk, both of us avoiding the gaping absence that Grandma left behind. With Grandma gone and Grandpa far away, my buffer against the loneliness at home was gone. The transition back to life where my sister's needs dominated was harder than ever. The contrast was stark, where my grandparents had made me feel. At home, I felt more invisible than before. The routines continued, and Emily's needs shaped our family life. I continued to fade into the background. The isolation wasn't just physical. It was emotional. During family gatherings, conversations would circle around Emily's latest treatments or her challenges. I'd chip in where I could, trying to share bits about school or friends. But it often felt like speaking into a void. My words seemed to dissipate the moment they left my lips. They were unimportant and fleeting. At school, I started to withdraw. Friends invited me to hang out, but I found myself declining more often, opting instead to spend time alone. It was easier than explaining why I was down or why I didn't feel up to pretending everything was okay. They knew about Emily, of course, but no one really understood the full weight of living in her shadow, of having my own needs and desires perpetually sidelined. I was feeling guilty for these feelings. Emily didn't choose her health issues. I knew my parents were doing their best under tough circumstances, but that didn't make it any easier to deal with the neglect I was feeling, or to fill the gap in my life that was left by the lack of familial warmth as I got used to this new reality. I realized that I needed to find new sources of support and new ways to feel valued. I turned to teachers, coaches, and any adult who might offer a word of encouragement or a moment of recognition. Each small acknowledgement felt like a lifeline, a reminder that I had to learn to be more than just the healthy sibling, more than just the other child. Looking back, losing my grandparents marked the end of their physical presence in my life and also the end of my childhood. It forced me to face the imbalance in my family head-on and to start seeking ways to carve out my own space and my own identity, independent of the family drama that had so long defined me. Sibling rivalry is typical in most families, but when your sibling has special needs, the dynamics can shift drastically. The term rivalry doesn't even feel right. It's not like we were ever competing on the same level. Emily's needs always came first, which I understood on a rational level, but emotionally it was a whole different story. It all came to a head one evening that felt like any other at first. I was in the middle of a gaming session, a rare moment of relaxation in a house that often felt like a revolving door of therapists and medical crises. Emily was having a tough day. She was in more pain than usual, which made her short-tempered and moody. Her parents were trying to comfort her, but nothing was really working. That's when things took a turn for the worse. Emily lashed out. It wasn't the first time she had a tantrum, but this time my gaming console bore the brunt of her anger. The controllers flew, the console crashed to the floor, and the game I was in the middle of vanished into a screen of static. I was stunned, just staring. At the wreckage of what was my only real escape from the everyday stress, I looked to my parents for support, hoping they'd see the impact of Emily's actions on me. Instead, I got a hurried apology as they scooped her up to calm her down. They were more concerned with her tears and her reasons for the outburst than the fact that she destroyed my property, which mattered to me. It was clear that her immediate needs were more important than any of my feelings. After Emily calmed down and everyone else seemed to move on, I was left with a broken console and a growing resentment that no amount of silent brooding could dissipate. I lay in bed thinking about how unfair it was that her needs not only came first but seemed to be the only needs that mattered. It wasn't her fault she was in pain or that she had limitations, but why did that mean I had to be the collateral damage over the next few days? I tried to brush off the incident, but I was still pretty frustrated. I found myself snapping at people over small things, withdrawing further into myself. My parents noticed, but they thought my mood was just typical teenage angst. They thought it was stress from school or just a phase. They suggested I try getting more sleep or talking to someone like a school counselor. Felt like another dismissal. It felt like they were saying my problems weren't as significant. This was around the time I first brought up the idea of therapy. I wasn't sure what to expect from family therapy, but I was desperate for anything that might help us communicate better. To my surprise, my parents agreed. Maybe they realized things were starting to spiral, or maybe they hoped a professional could smooth over the growing cracks in our family dynamics. Either way, we found ourselves sitting in a stark, quiet room across from a therapist who seemed genuinely interested in hearing from each of us. Therapy sessions started to become part of our weekly routine, while they were supposed to be a space for we were all there to improve our communication and understanding. At first, it felt like we were just going through the motions. My parents were eager to rectify their past neglect and initially threw themselves into the process with a kind of desperate energy. For a brief period, it seemed like we were making genuine progress. The therapist encouraged us to share our feelings openly, which was a new and uncomfortable experience for everyone. I talked about feeling like an outsider in my own family and about the pain of having my needs and interests consistently overlooked. It was really freeing to be able to talk about these things and have them acknowledged by someone who didn't immediately dismiss them as teenage drama. My parents listened properly for the first time in a long time. They seemed shocked to hear how much their actions or lack of action had affected me. There were tears, apologies, and promises to do better. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that change was possible and that we could find a new normal where I wasn't just an afterthought. We started putting these intentions into practice. We started having more structured family time. We decided that once a week, we would do something as a family that didn't revolve around Emily's medical needs or preferences. It was a small concession, but it meant a lot to me. The first few times were awkward, but also kind of nice. We went to movies, visited museums, and even spent an afternoon bowling. These activities had no direct connection to hospitals, therapy, or medical discussions. However, the shift in focus didn't go unnoticed by Emily had grown used to being the center of our parents' attention, and the sudden change made her jealous. It started with small comments here and there, subtle digs about how much fun we must have had without her or how it was nice for her to have some quiet time at home. Her tone was light, but the underlying message was clear. She felt left out and unhappy about it. The situation escalated quickly during what was supposed to be a calm family dinner. She broke down and accused our parents of neglecting her and forgetting about her needs in favor of spending time with me. Her reaction was intense and fueled by a mix of genuine fear of being left out and a manipulation tactic she had learned to use effectively. My parents were caught off guard and riddled with guilt. They stumbled over themselves to reassure her and apologize for making her feel that way. The backlash was immediate. Our scheduled outings became fewer and farther between, and when they did happen, they were overshadowed. My parents were caught between trying to balance their new commitment to me with their natural inclination to cater to Emily's emotional and physical well-being. They couldn't manage the balancing act, and things gradually returned to their previous state. I suggested we revert to the way things were before, as I felt guilty and responsible for the disruption. The therapist was great and pushed back on this. They said this reaction was exactly why we were in therapy, to break these unhealthy patterns, not reinforce them. So we kept going to the sessions and each one got more intense. Emily's feelings of jealousy and abandonment became a central theme, and we spent a lot of time addressing her fears and insecurities. It felt like we were moving backwards, focusing on her even in a space that was supposed to be about fixing the broader family. In a particularly intense session, Emily made a bold accusation. She claimed that our parents favored me over her, that they loved me more because I was the normal one. The accusation stung and threw our parents into a tailspin of self-doubt and confusion. They reassured her, sometimes at the expense of their own emotional well-being and certainly at the expense of the progress we had made. It was a painful cycle to watch and even harder to be a part of. I began to feel it felt like I was the villain in my own family story, just because I wanted a bit of the attention and love that came so easily to Emily. I found myself pulling back again, and I stopped going to the therapy sessions. I also stopped trying to be more present in the family. What was the point if it only caused more pain? The breaking point came when my parents suggested we all see a different therapist. They thought maybe a fresh pair of eyes could help. A fresh start could smooth things over, but I saw it as an attempt to shield Emily and perhaps find someone who would tell them they were doing the right thing by focusing so much on her. I felt defeated by all the talks, all the sessions, all the promises of change. It seemed like they were just empty words that were easily blown away by the first sign of difficulty. I was tired of fighting. I was tired of feeling like my presence was a burden or a cause of conflict. So I pulled away, resigned to the status quo. It felt like Emily's world was the only one that mattered, and I was just living in it. The cycle of therapy sessions and rehashed promises became too much. I was emotionally and mentally drained from the constant tug-of-war for my parents' attention. It seemed like no matter what we discussed in those sessions, the outcome was always the same. Emily's needs overshadowed everything else, and my feelings were just side notes that were acknowledged but never really addressed. The breaking point came during a particularly tense therapy session. During one of our sessions, we were all sitting awkwardly in the room. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken frustrations. The therapist had been trying to help us achieve a more balanced family dynamic, but it felt like we were stuck in the Middle Ages. My parents were clearly stressed, torn between their two children. Emily was visibly upset, feeling like she was losing her grip on the only reality she knew, one where she was the primary focus. I had prepared myself to speak openly that day to really lay out how I felt. I needed them to understand the depth of my isolation within. I took a deep breath and started talking. I didn't just skim the surface with general statements about feeling left out. I dove deep and shared how hurt I was that my achievements and milestones felt ignored. I also shared how it felt like my birthdays were just days on the calendar to them. I shared how I felt more like a roommate than a son. The room was quiet as I spoke. It felt like the kind of silence that's heavy and holding back a storm. My parents looked shocked, perhaps. Emily seemed agitated and shifted in her chair as I shared my feelings. When it was their turn to respond, the reaction wasn't what I had hoped for. My parents were defensive and started with apologies, as they had before, but quickly shifted to justifying their actions. They talked about the complexity of Emily's health issues and said her needs weren't just preferences but necessities. They said they were doing their best under difficult circumstances. Then Emily spoke up. Her voice was shaky with emotion. She accused me of trying to make her feel guilty for things beyond her control. She said I was being selfish for wanting what she saw as equal attention. The therapist tried to steer the conversation back to a constructive path, but the damage was done. The air was thick with hurt feelings and accusations. I felt a mix of anger and despair. It was clear that no amount of talking was going to change the fundamental dynamics in our family. It was clear that talking wasn't going to change the fundamental dynamics in our family. My parents were too focused on their role as caregivers for Emily to see beyond her immediate needs, and Emily wasn't ready to see our family as anything but centered around her. The session ended with an agreement to keep trying, but as we left, I knew something had shifted. The faint hope I had held on to that therapy could bring us to a better understanding had evaporated. I was done trying to fight, for I stopped trying to explain my feelings to people who didn't seem to understand their importance. Over the next few weeks, I withdrew and spent more time alone, focusing on school and my own interests outside of home. My parents noticed but seemed unsure how to bridge the gap that had widened between us. They made tentative attempts to connect, asking about my day or my plans for the weekend, but it felt hollow. Emily also noticed my withdrawal, but her response was mixed. Part of her seemed relieved. She was happy to have the spotlight back on her, but she also seemed curious about my newfound independence. She asked me a few times about my activities, and she seemed interested, but we were both too scarred from past conflicts to really open up again. As the weeks turned into months, my plans for the future began to take shape with more clarity. I realized that I needed to find my own path, one that didn't involve waiting for my family to recognize my needs. I started researching colleges and scholarships. I was looking into programs that interested me, and I was putting my energy into building a life where I didn't feel like a secondary character. My relationship with my parents was still a bit strained. We spoke, we shared meals, and we lived under the same roof, but there was an unspoken understanding that things were different now. They continued to focus on Emily, and they were more cautious in their interactions with me, perhaps afraid of sparking another confrontation. The suggestion to switch therapists came up again, and this time it was more urgent. My parents were hopeful that a new therapist could help mend the fractures within our family. I felt like agreeing to start a book you already knew the ending of would be pointless and exhausting. I told them it was too late for new beginnings in therapy. That ship had sailed, and I was already looking toward new horizons. They were disappointed, but there was also a resignation in their acceptance. They recognized that they had missed too many opportunities to make things right. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just resolved. I was resolved to move forward. I decided to build my own world where I was more than just an afterthought. It wasn't the family dynamic I had hoped for, but it was one I could live with. I knew I had tried and that I had finally chosen to prioritize my own well-being. After I moved out and reduced contact with my family, my life started feeling more like mine. I wasn't just the older brother who was always sidelined by my sister Emily's needs. I was just me, living my own life and making my own rules. I moved to a new city and decided to reduce contact with my family. They're my family, but the constant neglect had taken its toll. I needed space to figure out who I was outside of that dynamic. At first, the quiet was strange. There was no background noise of Emily's needs or the chaos that usually surrounded them. It was just me and my thoughts, which was scary and freeing at the same time. I found a small apartment, got a job that I didn't mind, and started piecing together a routine. That was all my own when my first birthday rolled around after the move. I wasn't expecting much, maybe a call if I was lucky. But the day came and went with silence. No calls, no texts, nothing. It hit harder than I expected. I didn't want much. I just wanted a sign that they remembered I existed outside of Emily's world. I ended up spending the day alone, reflecting on everything that had led to this point. It was a sobering reminder of why I had put distance between us. I decided to let it slide without making a fuss. Instead, I used it as motivation to invest more into my new life. I started making friends, some really good ones, people who showed up for me, who remembered small details and made plans to hang out after work, grab drinks, or just chill at someone's place, playing games or watching movies. Little by little, I began to feel part of something again, a community where I wasn't just the other kid. The next year, I approached my birthday with a new mindset. I stopped checking my phone for missed calls or messages from home. Instead, I planned a big night out with my friends. We went to a couple of bars, laughed more than I had in years, and celebrated until the early hours. It was the best birthday I'd ever had. For the first time, I wasn't an afterthought. I was the main event, and it felt amazing. Days later, curiosity got the better of me, so I called home. Sure enough, they had forgotten. He apologized for how things were going with Emily. It stung a bit, but it also solidified my resolve that I was doing the right thing by keeping my distance. My life was here now with people who valued me. By the third year in my new city, my birthday had become something I genuinely looked forward to. I threw another big party, this time even bigger. We rented out a space, had a DJ, and so on. It was a blast. Friends both old and new showed up to celebrate. It was during this party that I was surrounded by people who cared about me. I realized how much I had been missing out on all those years. Once again, I made that call to my family. As expected, they had forgotten my birthday. This time, I didn't even bother bringing it up. We chatted briefly about mundane things, and that was it. That call was short and stark contrast to the warmth and joy of my celebrations. It confirmed that, while they were my family by blood, my real family was made up of the friends who stood by me. My real family was made up of the friends who stuck by me. The difference with these relationships was stark. With my friends, I was never just an add-on. I was an integral part of the group. They didn't just remember my birthday. They made it special. They didn't just listen to how my day went. They were a part of my day. We supported each other through job changes, breakups, successes, and failures. We built a network of mutual care and respect. This is something I had always longed for but never quite experienced with my own family.